One other maybe observation too that we had talked about before is a lot of what we're describing is sort of the balance of power, and then what is the process by which Congress can effectuate that, right? So, TBA included negotiating objectives, including consultation requirements, included some procedures, all of which were designed to sort of bring the administration to the table to have that discussion. If that discussion is not as fulsome now as it could be, I think it's an interesting question on the process side or on the institutional side. There's a whole set of things you could consider that aren't getting into defining national security or defining an unfair trade practice. I think that will be more complicated politically, getting that sort of institutional bipartisan commitment, but perhaps more on the are we more effective in what we've tried in the past. But
I'll try to be really, really brief. Couple points, and I agree with a lot of what the folks just said, including Brian, on having a more comprehensive look at social safety nets. I think that's absolutely something that needs to be done. Barbara, to your point, I mean, the Constitution also says Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, so it's not just the tariff authority.
Good point.
And that gets lost in, I think, the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a great, really hard question, but I think I'd break it out into two parts. There's kind of these specific things we can do on the legislative front, some of which Paul and others have touched on. How do you beef up some of the requirements in fact so that the administration, you got to step back. You can come up with, it's easy to legislate lots of different things. Think about what's the objective. The primary objective that I hear everybody talking about is you want to incentivize the administration to pay attention to Congress as it negotiates an agreement. And to incentivize, and so then you can come up with 15 different ways to incentivize them. And I think that's the trick. I don't think in 2015 TPA that they really did a fulsome rethink of that, and they didn't strike the right balance of creating new incentives, and that's kind of playing out, in my view, today. But Ed, I think what Congress, if I were back up there right now, I'd actually be focusing a little bit less on the legislative front. I mean, I think I would immediately try to clarify the procedures for withdrawal, but beyond that, I mean, there's an 800-pound gorilla in the room called China and the administration's China strategy, and how much of what they're really doing is flowing from their views on China. And it's a complicated, big, vexing issue. And what I don't really get the sense of from Congress is Congress inserting itself in that process. I share many of the concerns. I mean, I think it's now conventional wisdom around town that there is a situation with China. We thought their entry into the WTO would help them progress towards becoming a market economy. What we've seen is that they've maintained a state capital system, or a form of state-directed capitalism that's been fairly successful for their model. And the question is, what do we do now? The administration is embarking on some course, and I don't think there's a lot of clarity about what that course is. The way I've broken it out is the president going to be transactional and just look at trying to get a couple of wins on, lifting FDI caps in a couple of sectors. Shout out to my life friends. I know, let's get those equity caps lifted for life insurance. But is it going to be transactional, or is this really a major rethink and trying to force China to come to one of two things? Either force China to come to the table and really start down a different road in terms of reform, or absent that working, is it trying to figure out what is the U.S. response to the challenge or the opportunity or challenge that China presents? And we don't know, and I want to see Congress get involved in that discussion. And I'm not sure Congress, and frankly, our former committees are getting involved in that discussion. And they should be getting involved in that discussion because it's a big issue that affects the companies and it certainly affects the U.S. economy.
Maybe just a few points. I agree with a lot of what's already been said. I think with respect to the first question, the question is much broader. It's really about what the U.S. is doing to adjust to the broader global trends in the economy. And trade policy, I think, is it's an easy outlet to to place sort of the onus on when there are so many other issues, I think, that that need to be dealt with, some of which we've already talked about here, but sort of whether it's education or training or kind of the broader view, some of which, you know, TAA addresses, but largely doesn't address. And these are not all effects that are driven by trade, although trade is often the one to blame, because it's much easier to blame trade than it is to blame a robot for job losses. I would say that that with respect to what Congress can also do more of now, it's a combination. I think sort of what you touched on, Viji. It's a PR effort as much as it is a legislative point effort. You know, what can Congress do being closer to the American people? After all, you know, what we're seeing here in terms of trade are issues that are bubbling up from people in this country who are believing that perhaps they're not seeing the benefits of trade that they should be, or what we in Washington talk about that would be the benefits of trade. So how can we talk about these issues in a better way and how can Congress be a part of that to help sort of figure out the national debate on how we think about trade in a different way? Because they're oftentimes closer to people, and these issues can be used in a more constructive way.
So I'm gonna grab the microphone, Grant. I want to ask kind of the rubber hit the road question, and maybe I'm not sure if we'll have time for any more, but there's a belief that one scenario that may play out in the next few weeks potentially is that agreement in principle is reached on the NAFTA. It doesn't meet all the terms that are laid out in Trade Promotion Authority. It is handed off to the Congress with the threat that we're also, if you don't pass it, we're going to withdraw. So my question is, I mean, that is, at least that's sort of what we're hearing. That's the other elephant. Maybe one's a gorilla in the room, one's the elephant. So what will Congress do and what should Congress do if they're handed with that ultimatum?
Who wants to jump on that?
So the first thing they should do, of course, is act before that happens. And it's to lay down the marker that, in fact, anything that is going to come back through that doesn't meet the terms of TPA is going to have to go through the normal legislative process. And that withdrawal is not an option. And if they need to then spark that, you know me, Ken, when we first met, my whole idea is you bring the fight forward. And this is one where you bring the fight forward, right? And to Neena's point, I think that's the only clarifying way of deciding whether the circumstances have changed so fundamentally that we actually have to make some changes in the law. Because I take your point about being sensitive to the longer view. But I think you bring that fight forward for precisely the reason. Now, what will they do? I think nothing.
Yeah, I think you've heard some discussion about, well, there might be an opportunity for veto-proof legislation that would essentially reject the president's withdrawal from NAFTA, perhaps along the lines we talked about constitutionally. It's hard to pass anything, but I also don't think Congress should allow itself to be blackmailed in this way. You know, look, no free trade agreement has lived up to every principal negotiating objective. In fact, you know, Bob Lighthizer, who many of us know, was my first boss at DC, some of you know. But one thing I remember him lobbying me on when I was up in the Finance Committee was on border adjustability of taxes, ironically. And he pointed out that that's long been a principal negotiating objective in TPA. Of course, it was like number 1 in 1974, then it went to like number 5, and it's like, you know, now it's like 19 or 20. And we fell down the list. But, you know, we never negotiated a trade agreement to deal with border adjustability of taxes. But yet we've passed all these FTAs. So these are political directions in TPA. But if there are things, apart from what TPA says, that Congress truly objects to, and the president brings forth an agreement like that, I think you could very well see sort of the Columbia-type reaction, which is, you know, go stick it up your ass, frankly. You know? That's what I would say.
So the non-answer is, let's hope we don't get to that point. But to play it out, what happens is, so if he does the withdrawal at the same time time he submits and I submit the TPA, and actually my money's always been on, if I were Lighthizer, I would negotiate an agreement that didn't have to go back through Congress. And again, that would save certain retailers in the room, because the apparel rules of origin are the one thing I think you can't change by statute. That and Chapter 19, getting rid of that would also require statutory changes that he can't do through executive action. So that's actually where my money's always been. If you get rid of ISDS, I don't think you have to put the agreement back through Congress. You change the auto rules of origin, you don't need to put the agreement back through Congress. You change the labor chapter, the environmental chapter. None of those changes, maybe some of the government procurement stuff, but I'm not sure that stuff has even been tabled. Right now, I'm not seeing a lot that would actually require this to go back through Congress if you stay out of textiles and apparel. That's where my money's always been. Okay, separate from that issue is, what should Congress do? And I think it's exactly right. They should say this is the process for withdrawal, but they would have to find a veto-proof piece of legislation or must-pass piece of legislation to attach that to. And I'm not sure what the next vehicle is. I'm sure there's some, something in the fall, maybe an appropriations bill, but again, then you're getting into kind of standoff that nobody really likes. It throws business into a lot of uncertainty. It's just not a pretty place for anybody to be. So that's why I go back to my first comment, which is hopefully it won't happen. Hopefully they will figure out a way to come to an agreement, that the congressional consultation processes will work, and that they will be able to come to an agreement that is largely acceptable to Congress. As Brian pointed out, every principal negotiating objective, none of them are mandatory. They are all, in fact, discretionary, and plenty of them get ignored. And the question is, how much is Congress willing to let them ignore?
And I think, adding to what Viji said, I think, Congress needs to have this fight up front before this happens, as others have said here. Congress has been influential over the past several months, as we've seen exclusions in the 232 action, I think the notice and comment in the 301 action. I think Congress has been working in many ways behind the scenes on these issues, just because we see the impacts of some of these measures and retaliation or potential retaliation on very important constituencies in Congress, and that is definitely a driving factor for members to be more engaged in a way that they haven't been before. To answer the question on what Congress does, I think there are a lot of factors here, right? So I think a lot of it depends on timing. Look, we're in a midterm year, if the president would take such an action, when does this happen in the big scheme of things? There's changes of leadership that are going to be happening in the House as well. So there may be potential differences in that regard, depending on who's in charge. And then if something like this were to happen, are there other means? We haven't talked much about the courts today, and the question about, what I sort of touched on earlier about litigation. Is there litigation that could happen out of something like this? But who actually has standing to bring a case? Is it members of Congress? Is it the private sector? Who is it in terms of those types of actions?
And I was just going to have one just thought is that, one thing that I've noticed that's very different, with the NAFTA renegotiation is pretty much every congressional office, every state, R&D has a much better understanding of how important or central or integrated their constituents' livelihoods are into NAFTA. So however this plays out, the stakes are very high, and it is interesting, NAFTA is something you just didn't talk about, because it had so much, it was like a loaded term, but now it's much more granular, that people understand their consequences. And so that doesn't necessarily mean this will happen or that will happen, but that's a very different dynamic, and certainly the chance of it might be gone is a different dynamic that's very real in a political kind of constituent level way that I think maybe will shape some of this dynamic as we go forward.
Yeah, the threat to withdraw is the best thing that ever happened to NAFTA, right? I just wanted to point out, in response to the question, something I should have said. Of course, the TPA timelines are such that, from formal introduction until vote, you've got 90 days. But those are session days, right? Those are the days the House is in session. And I think if you were to count right now, I think there are fewer than 90 session days planned for the rest of this year. So in truth, if Congress didn't want to be quite so dramatic as Columbia, they could essentially exercise the equivalent of a pocket veto and just not do anything on it. And it expires at the end of this year.
First, I'll just say, I hope you all join me in thanking our panel. This has been fantastic. Lots of questions, lots of topics to cover. Maybe we'll just come back next year and see where we are.
I think we might need to come back next week. I haven't looked at my tweets to see if we need to come back to it in the next hour. Thank you all for being here. Sorry we couldn't take more questions, but it was such a fulsome conversation. Really, I'm incredibly grateful to all of you. Thank you for helping take us to school a little bit on the role of Congress and trade. Thanks.